My co-founder and I basically had this idea of starting a gamified application for the financial markets.
TradingLeagues is the world's first skills-based, interactive, fantasy trading game.
With trading and investing, you kind of have to just plunge in. Hopefully you kind of know what you're doing. It's not a great proposition. That's what we're trying to change, with TradingLeagues.
Can you talk about the concept of gamification and how important is gamification in businesses currently?
What a game does is it creates a micro event within a grander experience. We call that experiential learning. You're not learning because of some pop quiz you're going to have at the end of the year.
Don't tell me about those. I don't know if you heard the story of GameStop.
What made the whole GameStop saga super unique was a confluence of multiple factors. Number one,
what in your mind is the future of gaming, video games, and the gamification of things?
So what I would predict is,
in this month's episode, I sat down with Raghu Kumar, a serial entrepreneur whose latest venture, called TradingLeagues, is trying to gamify the financial market. We talk about today's trend of businesses gamifying their user experience, which is very important, and it stems from video games. And we obviously talk about the importance of the video game industry today and video games in general. Raghu also shares his advice and lessons learned from his more than 15-year journey in business and in entrepreneurship for anybody who's willing to start their own business or become an entrepreneur. And with all that said, let's uncover Raghu's story. Raghu, it is a pleasure to have you here on the show. Thank you so very much for finding the time to talk with me today. I'm very excited to chat. I want to start off by talking about a little bit about your background. And you are a serial entrepreneur, having created more than one successful business. And we're going to get into all of that for sure in this episode. But there's always a story behind an entrepreneur. And I would like to start our conversation exactly with that. Talk to me about what steered you towards the entrepreneurial route, and what are those bits and pieces of your life that make up who you really are today?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me on this podcast.
It's a pleasure.
So to be honest, I'm not sure how I became an entrepreneur. I think with me, I kind of describe myself as like an accidental entrepreneur. Growing up, you have a certain notion in your mind as to what an entrepreneur is. You assume a very kind of a flashy lifestyle. Obviously money, comes to mind. And I never thought of myself as being that. I grew up in a very middle class kind of a household. Neither of my parents were really entrepreneurs, although my mom did run a daycare at home, and she was basically an entrepreneur, but she never thought of herself as being an entrepreneur. And so now looking back, when I try to connect the dots, I do see a lot of traits in my mom that, I think me and my brother both also have. But yeah, I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I got into trading, when I was in college, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But basically, when I was in college, I realized I wanted to become a full-time trader. And then after I graduated, I basically set up my own proprietary trading company. And one day I realized, hey, it makes more sense to just incorporate a partnership just to save on taxes. And really, that's what happened. Just because I could save on taxes, that's how I became an entrepreneur. And then one thing led to another. And then before you know it, now I call myself an entrepreneur. So yeah.
Well, and a successful one at that. That's for sure. What I find really interesting is that it came organically for you. So it's not like you set out to do it. You didn't quit your job to do that. If I'm correct, right? You didn't have to make a big decision. It just kind of slowly progressed towards you finding your passion in entrepreneurship and trading, right?
Exactly. So, the backstory to me trading was basically when I was in high school. I had a high school teacher, a microeconomics teacher. I was, probably 15 or 16 years old at the time. And on the first day of class, she said, to all her students, hey, we're going to have a little competition. I'm going to ask each of you to build a portfolio of stocks. and the student with the best performing portfolio at the end of the year gets an A in the class, right?
Oh,
So yeah, and I knew nothing about trading, nothing about investing, and we had one day to basically make our portfolios. So I went home, I thought about it a little bit, and I realized, okay, only one kid is going to get the A in the class. So how do I win this competition? Because I was always very competitive. I was always a very competitive
right.
kid. And so I started researching a little bit, and there's something called penny stocks, right? Penny stocks are basically like super cheap stocks, which are very, very volatile, like the complete opposite of like, a Microsoft, Google, Apple, etc. So I built a portfolio of penny stocks and I took it to the teacher the next day and I showed it to her and she was like, Raghu, like I wasn't expecting any kid to make a portfolio of penny stocks, but I'm going to let you get away with it. And long story short, I ended up winning the competition because I
Oh,
understood
wow.
how volatility essentially was very important towards winning this competition, right? So that got me fascinated with this concept of making money, with trading. And I kind of always had that in the back of my mind. And then when I went to college, I was basically a very reluctant college student. I didn't really want to be in college. And so,
Right.
um, so I would go to class, I would do all my required assignments and all that, and then I would go home and then I would research trading and how to build, trading models. And then I got introduced to this concept of algorithmic trading, which is essentially when you build algorithmic trading strategies, right? And that led to me, essentially almost dropping out of school. I did technically finish school, but I
Okay.
finished a 4-year degree in 2.5 years with a very, very bad GPA. And I tell everybody this.
Okay.
And then I basically started trading full time using my own capital and my brother's capital. So that led to me getting into trading. And then trading eventually led me to moving to India and setting up Upstocks, which is my first company. So I think, long story short, everything had a connecting dot before it. But when you're in that situation, you never really know what those dots are going to be and how they're all going to kind of, connect with each other. So yeah, I think the term organic is a great term that's used.
Right, right. And I think when something is organic, I think it's a little bit more probably easier on life when you do it organically and when it's something that just comes from within. May I ask you, at such a young age, how did you teach yourself about trading? Did you read books, read it online, or maybe you had a mentor?
Yeah, so not really. So, I was always really interested in statistics. So I majored in actuarial science, which is basically, a profession where, you eventually join an insurance company and you help the insurance company come up with those models that they use, right? That's what actuaries do.
I see.
So I was always very interested in statistics and mathematics. And when I discovered algorithmic trading, I realized that I could build mathematical models, right? And all I had to
Hmm.
do
Wow.
was basically understand how the markets work. So the markets are just driven by human beings, right? People drive the stock markets. It's basically an environment where a bunch of people come together, and then there is a market price that's determined based on supply, demand, et cetera, right? But those are the nuances. But fundamentally, because they're driven by human beings display patterns with whatever we do, right? So if you can discover a pattern and find a way to capitalize on it um, in a way where you're not taking on too much risk, right, compared to your reward, then you can essentially consistently make money because of the fact that humans are driven by patterns, right? So that fundamental thought I kind of realized. And also when I was in college, I would read a lot. I would read a lot about um, successful traders, right? There's a very successful group of traders called the turtle traders. And if you look up the turtle traders, essentially it's this group of people who had no trading experience. What they did was they discovered this world of trading, and they were very smart, and they basically used rules based trading systems to consistently make a lot of money over a long period of time.
Wow.
So I saw that story and I was like, damn, this is actually really cool. maybe I could do something similar. And that's how I kind of got into it, you know?
That's really interesting because for the longest of times, trading, finance, and everything to do with that for me was very complicated and difficult. And it just took a close friend of mine slowly to explain to me how things work. And to this day, I really can't fully tell you that I do. And for me, it's a very risky business. But for someone like you or my friend and many others, when you find this pattern, and he also speaks about a certain pattern
Yeah.
that exists, then things become a bit more interesting. You actually, it's not a gamble. It's well, it's in a way you're just like kind of playing a game, right? You're
Right.
enjoying yourself, and you kind of know what you're doing. Speaking of it being run by people, I don't know if you heard the story of GameStop.
Hmm.
Maybe you have.
Yep.
How they artificially raised the price. That was
Right.
pretty crazy, if you ask me.
Yeah.
But there are sometimes those occasions that you think, well, that's pretty insane that something can happen artificially like that.
Yeah. And what made the whole GameStop saga super, super unique was a confluence of multiple factors. Number one, a lot of that activity happened during COVID, right? So during COVID, people were stuck at home. They didn't have much to do. They were bored. They had easy access to computers, right? So that's number one. Number
Yeah,
two, Robinhood was becoming very popular at that time, right? The discount stock brokerage. So now, as a retail trader, you could basically open up a funded account and start investing and trading for just maybe hundreds of dollars. And the whole interface and the simplicity, and there's almost like a sex appeal associated with it. It's like a very sexy thing to do, you know.
yeah,
um, and then, ultimately going back to the original point, which is the markets are driven by human beings. So you can have a small number of institutional funds doing something on this side, right? And the general premise was, oh, we have billions of dollars. We can basically bully the prices around because we can move the markets. But then if you get an army of people on this side, even if they're retail investors, the totality of their deposits and what they're doing could technically number what was happening on this side, and that's what happened, right? And then you throw in the fact that you know the Wall Street bettors were all getting behind the brick and mortar type of companies like GameStop and I think AMC and Blockbuster, and I think Blockbuster eventually went bankrupt. Um, but
yeah,
there's like a whole like passion behind it as well. It's like, oh, why should the brick and mortar companies go out of business? Let's drive up that price, right? And so it was a very fascinating concept, I think. But I think in the long run, these things kind of like equal out, right? Now, if you look at GameStop, actually, I've not really been following the stock price of GameStop, but I'm assuming it has fallen a lot since then, and that's usually what
yeah,
happens. It's
yeah.
a,
It
it's a
did. I
crash and
didn't
burn.
check, but it
Yeah.
it for sure did. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. But anyways, it was a fun situation, and
Yeah.
it's funny that it happened with GameStop from all companies, which
Right.
is very relevant to
Exactly.
to to uh, our conversation here.
100%.
Um,
Yeah.
you're an avid chess player, and what really caught my attention is that you mentioned that among other things, chess gives you the ability to see from someone else's perspective, and I can really connect to that because I think that you can really change, or a person can really change mentally when you start paying attention to the concept of perception versus perspective. And in your experience, how does the concept of perception versus perspective parallel challenges in business and decision making?
That's a really good question, actually. So,
Thank you.
I've really gotten into
Thank you.
chess the past, actually during COVID. During COVID is when I started playing a lot. I used to play as a kid, and then I stopped playing because
Yeah.
back then chess was just like not very cool. And now it seems to be
Yeah.
like a lot more cool to play chess. I have two kids and they play a lot of chess. In fact, I think my older son is probably going to start beating me pretty soon. But
That's the way to go.
yeah, but the cool thing about chess and any of these types of games or strategy games where it's not just about what you're doing, but you have to actually put yourself in the other person's shoes, right, to do well in chess, right? One of the best ways to actually gain an advantage in chess is like before you move, to spend some time thinking about why did the person make their move, you know? So getting concept, getting introduced to the concept of, like, I guess, game theory, um, is intrinsically kind of a part of being good at a game like chess. It doesn't have to be chess, right? It can be any type of strategy game or activity. And so, yeah, I think regarding your question about perspective versus perception, um, I'm not sure if I can answer that super detailed, but I think one thing that's important in chess, and then also in business, I would say, actually, right? Trying to draw that corollary between playing something like chess and running a business or being an entrepreneur, is that it's not just about yourself, right? There's so many moving parts, right? As an entrepreneur, you have to think about your business partners, about your all your team members, employees, et cetera, stakeholders,
Yeah,
investors, your customers. So before you make any decision, you have to think about all of their perspectives. How are they going to react to what you're doing? What are they expecting you to do? When something happens, how are you reacting? Are you reacting in a knee-jerk fashion? And even tying this back to the topic of trading and investing in a kind of rules-based approach, right? Which is something, as an algorithmic trader, you're basically taught to do. Rules-based approach means you're essentially taking the emotions out of the equation, right? You're not reacting in an
okay,
emotional
interesting.
manner, right? So, if I wanted to build a trading system involving GameStop um, during the COVID era, the best system would have been one where I was just reacting to data and not necessarily what people were saying, et cetera, et cetera. Right.
I see. I
So,
see.
yeah, in running a business, I think it's really important to try to make decisions in an objective manner, in a rational manner, and taking the emotions out of the equation, but not ignoring things as well, right? I can't ignore what the other person is doing, what the other person is saying. I have to take that into account and then give the appropriate, weight to whatever happened and then move on, right?
It's kind of easy to say start a business, but when you really have to do it, there's a lot of things that you have to take into account. Just a simple matter of filing the documents. Already that takes a lot from you, and I think you really have to be in a certain mindset and be ready to do it and be ready to commit, because once it's running, it's your responsibility. In a way, it's your baby. So you really have to put your perspective in order, because you got to see, okay, so 1 year or 2 years in front, what's going to happen. And I don't think it's the best notion to start a business and live it day to day. So
Yeah.
I think this is a great connection with chess, where you could try to foresee a little bit into the future to be able to kind of mitigate any sort of potential failures that you can encounter down your road. And well, probably there's going to be a few.
Yeah. And I'll take that one step further. So you brought up an interesting idea here. When you start a business, right? When you start a business, what are some of the things you have to do? You got to first, maybe you have a job that you're quitting, or you need
Yeah,
to tell your family and friends, right? And try to get their
yeah,
either a soft or a hard approval. You got to convince yourself, right? You got to convince yourself that this is the right thing you want to do. But then eventually you got to take that first step, right? And when you take that first step, the best strategy then is to follow through, because you're not going to get any sort of feedback right after one step. It's only after you've been doing it for a certain amount of time that you can really figure out whether you made a mistake or not, right? So,
yeah,
same thing with chess. I mean, I think we're drawing a lot of chess analogies here, but in chess,
yeah,
you have to come up with a strategy. You come up with a strategy, and then you
yeah.
execute it, and then you have to then let that whole thing play out, and then learn from it and move on. So yeah, and I think it all comes down to just being logical and rational. I think ultimately that's what all this kind of comes down to. It's just trying to take the emotions out of the picture and just trying to be super objective and rational as much as you can.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And, just speaking about mistakes and failures, that's exactly what I want to talk about next. And I'm always, fascinated to talk about, someone's success, and especially when it's as interesting and as big as the projects that you're doing. But most of the time, we don't get there without any failures. So can you talk about your failures, if you had any, And how many times have you had to start over, and kind of what kept you
Yeah.
going throughout
So
all
I
those
think the
failures?
first thing to define is what is failure, right? What does failure really mean? I've always been a big fan of Kobe Bryant, the late Kobe Bryant.
Oh yeah,
And
absolutely, yeah.
right. And there's a famous line that he talks about how for him, failure was when you stop and you don't learn, right? Because the interviewer asked him a question about, how would you have felt if you had never won a championship? Would you have considered that a failure? And he's like, no, I would have, considered that as a situation where I would have been very frustrated, and then I would have tried to learn from not winning a championship so that I could do something better down the road, right? So I think
I see.
defining failure is like really important. As an entrepreneur, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're making
Right.
mistakes constant, like every day. You're mostly making mistakes. And
Yeah.
so I can't microanalyze every decision and then beat myself up for not getting everything
Of
correct.
course.
um, but what I've found, and again, I don't consider myself to be some super esteemed entrepreneur, but I think one thing which has allowed me to keep going is the fact that you don't leave the end goal out of sight, right? You know what the end goal is, and you're just going and going and going, right? And at some point, and sometimes you realize, hey, this is not the right path to pursue, so you stop and then you pivot, right? So I have started, a couple side projects along the way. Fortunately for me, with my two major businesses with Upstocks and TradingLeagues, I never really stopped pursuing them. Right. With Upstocks, I
Right.
basically pivoted from Upstocks to TradingLeagues. That's for multiple reasons. But it's not like I gave up or I decided to stop pursuing it. Right. But I have started like mini projects along the way. And after a few months, I realized, hey, this is just not for me. It's taking up too much time. I don't see the ROI associated with the activity. So I'm just going to stop it and move on. And, as long as you're okay with that decision, I think that's what's important. You have to be mentally okay with making that decision.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, to be mentally okay, because different entrepreneurs go through different routes, and some might start a business that is successful for the first 1 or 2 years, and then all of a sudden it's not interesting anymore, and then they have to pivot and pivot and pivot, and it takes a lot from your energy and motivation to then restart for the third or fourth time with all the mistakes that you have made, to come back anew and start something interesting. So that's it takes a lot from a person, and it's really interesting to speak about that, to see kind of what people had to go through, and how you manage to keep yourself going. So that's a great
But that can
motivation, kind of.
go, but that can go either way, right? So I can go through a chapter in my life, and then I can basically go from A to B, and then at the end of B, I can say, hey, you know what? This is not the right thing for me to do anymore. But during that process of going from A to B, I learned something, right? I learned
Yeah,
something, right? I've gone through some
yeah,
experiences. I've learned new skills. I've learned in whatever capacity. And so then if I look at it that way, then basically I'm in a better position to pursue
mm,
chapter C after
I
having
see.
gone through chapter B versus not having
Okay,
gone through chapter B, right? So I think it really depends on
that's
the
an interesting
perspective,
take.
right? Like the perception, the
There we go.
perspective you take. Exactly. Perspective versus
Yeah, yeah,
perception.
yeah.
Like it all depends on your perspective in that situation. Like, are you looking at the situation as a failure or actually as like a learning step, you know?
Right.
And
That makes
that's really
perfect
what
sense.
this whole thing I think comes down to.
But talking about one of your successful businesses, Upstocks, it's your, if I'm correct, it's your first successful venture,
Yeah, yeah, basically.
or
Yeah,
or
yeah,
let's say a big, yeah, big successful venture. Anyways,
yeah.
it's been up and running for 11 years, and it's still very strong. Could you talk about the story of founding Upstocks and exactly what it is?
Sure. So it's actually been 15 years. So my co-founder
Oh,
yesterday,
15. Okay.
he posted a really nice picture of me, him, and my brother, the third co-founder at Upstocks. The three of us in Dubai. Actually, I'm coming to Dubai,
Okay.
but we were in Dubai in 2009. That was our first kind of like vacation having taken, since we started Upstox. So we started Upstox basically in 2008. And we actually initially started off as a proprietary trading company, right? So going back to the earlier topic, what we did was we took whatever profits we had generated in the US, we moved to India, and we started trading algorithmically in India using trading strategies that we built in house. And so that's what we did as Upstocks from 2009 through 2012. And then 2012, we basically became a customer facing business, and we started taking on
I see.
customers, for the business. And Upstocks is basically a retail stock brokerage. So, we talked about Robinhood earlier. It's basically the
Right.
Robinhood of India. That's the simplest way of thinking about it. It's a discount stock brokerage. Customers at Upstocks basically are able to buy and sell stocks, futures, options, and different financial asset classes at significantly cheaper rates than the competition. Um, and Upstocks probably offers the number one trading platform in India as well. So it's a discount stock brokerage. I was living in India from 2009 through 2019, building up Upstocks. And then in 2020, I moved back to the US. I basically resigned from Upstocks so that I could move to the US. I took a sabbatical and then started TradingLeagues. So yeah, that's a quick backstory.
Well, that's great. Trading leagues is exactly my next question,
Sure.
but talking about Upstock, it's been a long journey. Any quick lessons, any advice throughout the 15-year journey that you had in the trading business? Just something quick.
Yeah, no, it's crazy because the time flies by with these things. And yesterday, when my co-founder posted that post on LinkedIn, I was just so surprised. Like I hadn't realized it's been 15 years.
Yeah, I
Because
can
first of
imagine.
all, it makes me feel like old. I don't, and I'm like, wow, damn, it's been a long time. But I think with these things, right? I think having that long term vision is actually really important. You know, going back to what you were saying earlier about filing the documents as an entrepreneur, that's important. But then you should be spending just as much time, if not more time, thinking about your mission statement, thinking about your vision, right? A lot of these
Right.
things we kind of think of them as like these weird check boxes I have to just kind of like check off and move on with it. But that's not true. And in fact, over the years, I've actually realized and learned that those types of activities are actually what matter maybe the most. Because when you have a long term vision, right? When you think about a pitch deck, in a pitch deck, you're going to have your title slide, then you have your mission and your vision,
Yeah.
right? Mission is
Hmm.
different than vision, right? Mission is the reason you wake up every day. Your vision is your long term vision, right? So when you have a long term vision, and that's like in the back of your mind, then I think like that's what keeps you going, right? Like you're just going to keep going until that vision is achieved, you know. And of course with me, I'm still very very early in my journey with TradingLeagues, and so maybe I should not be talking about this, but I do think it's important because I do find myself thinking about these things a lot, you know, because it's really easy otherwise to get frustrated and give up, right? Like 90% of startups fail, and
Yeah.
the odds are heavily stacked against you. And so you have to wonder, like, what is it that differentiates a successful company versus another company? And then the second thing is luck. I mean, luck is a part of the whole game. As a trader, like the term luck is not something you talk about a lot because you don't want to believe in luck in trading. But the
Yeah.
reality is in entrepreneurship, like you have to get lucky as well. Like, you know, I moved to India, and it happened to be that between the years of 2009 through 2019, the economy opened up a lot. You know, a business model like Upstocks was perfectly situated to do well, right? And a lot of things were moving in our direction. If they hadn't, then we would have gone bust, you know? And so you have to acknowledge luck, but you cannot be dependent on it, right? You have to understand that it's there. I think one good thing that comes out of that mindset is that you don't beat yourself up if you fail, right? Like if you, for whatever reason, if your business doesn't do well, you're not going to like beat yourself up because you could have just gotten unlucky, right? If you played in the
Yeah.
90s in the NBA, you are not going to win a championship because of a dude
Yeah.
named Michael Jordan, right? Like,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah. Absolutely
like,
unlucky guys there. Yeah.
yeah. So guys like Karl Malone, like, hopefully they don't beat themselves up because, like, it's not really their fault.
Yeah, I totally agree when you talk about luck. So, sometimes being at the right place at the right time really matters. But yeah, as you said, in trading, it's better to not fully, rely on luck. Could you just quickly, really quickly, talk about, one of your first investment meetings and trying to get an, outside investment? How did that go? How did you manage to secure the first big capital? Just real quick, if you can share that moment.
Sure. So with trading, we actually always traded our own capital. So we were a
Oh,
proprietary
okay.
trading company. Right? So proprietary means like your own, right? So we were basically trading our own capital. So fortunately for us, we never had to resort to taking outside capital
Oh,
for
wow.
trading.
Okay.
Although we
Nice.
did
Okay.
experiment, at one point in time, we had some strategies which were scalable, right? So we could scale. At that time, I think we were managing maybe a couple $1 million max, but our strategies could scale into the tens of millions. So we're like, you know what? Let's actually see whether we can raise outside capital. I think we spent like a few months trying to raise capital, and I hated the process. So my brother and my co-founder and I were like, screw this. Let's just stick to what we know works.
Okay. Interesting.
Um, so with trading, that's a different beast altogether. I mean, my current co-founder at Trading Leagues, before starting Trading Leagues with me, he basically was running a hedge fund. So he's told me a lot about, the stresses of raising capital and things like that. Um, but I think ultimately, whether it's raising capital for a trading company or even for a startup, right? You have to understand the pros and cons. There is a pro and a con associated with raising capital. You don't have to raise capital, right? There's a lot of very successful bootstrap companies. Really depends on your needs. If you need the capital and if you really feel, again, objectively that you're doing the business a service by raising capital, right? And you're doing a disservice by not raising capital, then you should raise capital. And then with that,
Got it.
you're going to have a lot of anxiety, right? And especially initially, like when you
Yeah.
go through the
I
first
can
meetings,
imagine.
right? I remember my first investor meeting when I was trying to raise capital, and it was a complete nightmare. I was just so nervous, and it is what it is. It comes with the territory.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then you kind of go through it over and over and over again, and then before you know it, it's like any other conversation where you're having with anyone. So you just kind of go through the
Yeah. Yeah.
motions, and then over time you get better and better, and then you get more and more comfortable.
Right. Right. Yeah, I would imagine. I would imagine, especially when you're talking about big sums of money. So this brings me to Trading Leagues, which is probably the most interesting topic of today's conversation, which is your latest venture. So you voluntarily stepped down from Upstocks after running it for 15 years, which, in my opinion, is quite a big decision and an important decision at that. And you briefly explained Trading Leagues by saying, and I want to quote you here: I started with a wacky idea, a crazy idea. Take the incredible world of gaming and couple it with the awesomeness of the financial markets. End quote. That's really intriguing. And can you talk about Trading Leagues and its goals, as well as the process of its ideation?
So I grew up, playing a lot of games, right? A lot of video games, and um, like
Nice,
even chess, right?
good.
Chess is technically a game as well, right? There's a gamification element, um, and then you start trading real money, right? And when you go into the formal financial markets, that's the way my co-founder and I kind of describe like investing and trading, right? You're dealing with the formal markets. Something happens, right? We start looking at the whole activity as a very formal activity, um, as like a serious activity, right? Think about a brokerage account, or even trading cryptos, whatever it is, right? I think Robinhood
Right.
did something interesting. They tried to make it a little bit more light and fun, but ultimately, you're still talking about having hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars in your brokerage account. We've all heard of a lot of people losing a lot of money very quickly day trading, right? So those things were always in the back of my mind. And, the biggest reason I actually stepped down from op stocks was because I wanted to move to the United States, right? I'm an American citizen and
Got it.
Upstocks is an Indian company. So it had nothing to do with like me continuing at Upstocks, right? It's a wonderful company. And so I took a sabbatical. I moved to the US, took some time off for myself. And then my co-founder and I basically had this idea of like starting a gamified application for the financial markets, right? Both my co-founder and I,
Interesting.
we play a lot of poker, so probably a little too much
Hmm.
poker. When I was in college, I would, again, I was not a very good student, and I would just play a lot of poker, man. I'll play a lot of poker, and it was not a good situation. But I think poker is an amazing strategic game, right? You're talking about so many different elements at play. You're learning about risk to reward. You're learning about, it's obviously strategy. It's a skills based game, but it's also the allure of poker is that you can come in, you can maybe buy in for like, let's say $10. And if you're playing against a bunch of people, you can make like maybe up to $100, right? At the end of the night, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So you
yeah.
can 10x
Yeah.
your capital in like one night, right? If you think about traditional investing and trading, if someone has a good year trading the stock markets, maybe they're making 20%, 30%, right? So the idea of like having to put in a lot of money into a brokerage account and maybe generating 10, 20, 30%, while for most people they're looking for the opposite, right? They're looking for a situation where they can
I
put in
see.
maybe a small amount of money and maybe make a lot of money in a skills based
I see.
environment. That's very important. So that's essentially what Trading Leagues is. It's a real money gaming application where we have different games. Each game is associated with a certain skill, and people come in. It's highly social activity, so you can chat with people. You can basically banter back and forth. You pay entry fees to play, and then if you win, the prize pool goes towards the winners of the game, just like poker or any sort of skills based game, right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to invert all the assumptions associated with the traditional financial markets. We're trying to make it fun, social, and just something where a complete newcomer can come in, spend a lot of time, and also in that process, learn about the nuances of the stock markets, right? Like people often ask me, how do I learn about trading? How do I learn about investing? What I tell them is, dude, it's just like how you learn anything else in life, right? If you want to become a good soccer player, you got to be playing a lot of soccer, right? You got to play a lot of whatever you want to be good at. But then when you're playing soccer, it's fun, right? It's a game. It's fun. You're spending a
Yeah.
lot of time
Yeah.
and you're slowly building up your skill, right? With trading and investing, that's usually not how it's done. You kind of have to just plunge in, put in a lot of money, and then hopefully you kind of know what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
So when you really think about it like that, it's not a great proposition for most people,
Right.
and so that's what we're trying to change, with Trading Leagues.
I see. Yeah, that's definitely a really good goal to have, and definitely a very exciting company. And I've taken a look at the website, and I've taken a look at some of your videos of how it's all played, and how it works. And it does seem very fun. Um, could you talk a little bit about the competition on the market and what differentiates you from them, or even if there is competition currently on the market?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it really depends on what you consider what competition is. Um, if I consider competition to be an interface where I'm just dealing with prices of stocks and cryptos, then maybe even up stocks is competition, right? But not really, right? Because I would go to an up stocks once I have the capital to fund an account, and then I can actively day trade and I can buy and sell stocks and cryptos on a Robinhood or on an Upstocks. Here, we're talking about a gamified environment. So, what we consider competition would be like a DraftKings, right? Or a FanDuel in the US, which is a fantasy sports. platform for football and other sports. And then there's similar types of fantasy gaming applications in Europe and in many countries around the world.
Yeah, there's one for football. I know that my friends play. They all play this one game. I forgot I think it's called fantasy football, I
Okay.
believe, where
Yeah.
it's you manage. Yeah, you manage basically like the football team, and they all go crazy about it.
Yeah.
I don't play it, but I know how addictive it might be.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on what your definition of competition is. In our case, we don't consider ourselves to have any direct competition. We have what we call indirect competition, but we actually think that by, through trading leagues, we're bringing more awareness to the financial markets, which can lead people to then down the road maybe open up a Robinhood account or a Binance account if they want to trade cryptos, or an Upstocks account if they want to trade stocks in India. So
That's very, very interesting. And are you, or currently at least, are you targeting gamers specifically, or people who are into gaming, or if you can talk about kind of your ideal user for the moment?
sure. So about 70% of our users are between the ages of 18 to 23. And
Okay,
right
that's very young.
now, about 65 to 70% of our users come from India and Nigeria. In fact, Nigeria is the number one country. And most of them have some sort of experience with cryptos as well. So, and the reason for that is because if you want to deposit money into trading leagues right now, you have to have a crypto wallet, right? So that basically directly targets users who have some sort of understanding of what cryptos are, or they have an existing crypto wallet. So that's currently how things are kind of shaping up right now. But down the road, probably even later this month, we're going to allow for users to deposit using fiat, right, which is like currency,
Okay.
which will
Yeah.
change the dynamics a lot. We're also looking to do a lot of things in the Middle East, right? So probably 1 year down the road, the target user demographic will change. But one of the cool things about trading these is that it's a global application. So again, when we think about stock brokerages and crypto exchanges, crypto not so much. Crypto is obviously decentralized, and it's a decentralized platform. But stock brokerages are usually domestic in nature, right? It's you're dealing with your own country's stock markets. We are a global application where users can come in from all around the world. It's a web based application, and that really opens up the application to a global audience, right? Which is pretty different from traditional stock brokerages.
Right, right, for sure. And I really think that the concept of gamification is something very interesting, and I think something very important, at least currently. And I just want to, drop, a couple of numbers at you. So just bear with me.
Sure.
So the gaming market currently is valued at roughly 200 to 250 billion dollars, depending on where you look. The worldwide gamer population is estimated to be around 3 billion people, from which 42% of the market share are represented by the Asia Pacific territory, which, is absolutely, crazy and amazing at the same time. And 50% of those games are actually played through mobile devices. So these are some statistics that kind of, add to the fact that gamification is very, very, very important. Now, with all that said, I'd like to quote you from one of the articles that you were mentioned in. The quote is, "Our goal is to introduce millions of Indians to the financial markets by leveraging the incredible power of gamification," end quote. So, can you talk about the concept of gamification, what it is, and how important is gamification in businesses currently?
So that quote was probably from 2023. That was before we had launched the global version of Trading Leagues,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, this
So
was before that.
yeah, so we basically raised our first round of funding in early 2023, and at that point in time, the application was an Indian product. It was a product just for Indians, right? So that's why I'm referencing Indians. And then in December, just 5 months ago, we basically opened up the application to a global audience. So going back to the concept of gamification, right? What does that mean? Gamification basically means I'm thinking of the platform as a game, right? When we're playing a game,
Okay,
we are not concerned about anything except winning that game, right? So what a game
I see.
does is it creates a micro event within a grander experience, right? When I'm playing the game of soccer, I coach my kids' soccer games every weekend, and I see their eyes kind of light up when they're on that soccer pitch, right? The soccer fields, because during that 1 hour, every kid on that field is just obsessed about one thing, which is to win the game. It's
Yeah.
not even about scoring, actually. It's
Yeah.
actually about winning, right?
Winning.
So
Yeah.
you want to
Yeah.
win the game. So that becomes what you're trying to optimize and prioritize, and everything kind of falls back from that, right? So it really focuses our mind into just that one variable, and it becomes something that I have a certain degree of confidence that I can control to a certain extent, right? And that's very powerful, because when I'm engaged on a game, whether it's on DraftKings or whether it's on TradingLeagues or any sort of real money gaming application, I'm just focused on that one event and trying to win that game. When I was in high school, I was obsessed with fantasy basketball, right? I used to come home every day, build my fantasy basketball lineup for the next day, and then me and my friends would compete. Would have bragging rights. Maybe we had some money on the line, and
Yeah.
and but the point was, like, just because of that one activity, though, I was so well versed into all the different players in the NBA. Like, you could ask me any
Yeah.
players, you know, like major statistics, and I would know. I would just
Yeah.
know off the top of my head.
Right.
I wasn't memorizing
Right.
anything. It's not like I was reading up and trying to memorize things. I was just trying to win the game, man. I was trying to win the game. I was trying to win every single week's lineups or whatever, right? And then in the grand scheme, maybe like a year down the road, if you were to ask me, "Hey, Raghu, like, let me, let's run some trivia by you," um, I would have been way more knowledgeable about the landscape of the NBA versus a year back, right? So we call that experiential learning, where you're learning through experiencing, right? You're not learning because of some pop quiz you're going to have at the end of the year or whatever, right? It's
Oh,
basically, it's basically
don't tell me about those.
it's the complete opposite of that. Now, how does
Yeah.
this compare to, let's say, traditional investing and trading? There's a place for that as well, right? If I have thousands of dollars, and if I kind of know what I'm doing, if I've been engaging with the financial markets for some time, and I kind of know how Bitcoin moves, how the Dow moves, how Apple moves, then it makes sense for me to invest in Apple, for me to invest in Bitcoin, right? Because I've been engaging with the financial markets. Going back to my kids were playing recreational soccer for the past 2-3 years, and now they're ready to make that step to the next level, right? Over here it's called
Right.
junior academy, because they've been doing rec for 2-3 years. They understand how to play soccer, and now they're ready for the next thing, right? So with the financial markets, unfortunately, that stepping stone doesn't exist for whatever reason. I don't know why that is, right? But you're kind of expected to go from knowing nothing to now opening up a brokerage account and potentially putting thousands of dollars on the line, just because that's the only way to do things. And
Right. I
to
see.
us,
I
that's not a
see.
very good argument.
I
So
see. I
yeah,
see.
gamification is very powerful.
I really, what caught my attention is when you said experiential learning. I haven't heard that what's called a term before, and I think if only universities or schools have adopted something like that, I think teaching and learning would be completely different, and it would be much more enjoyable. Just to add a little bit of play into whatever you're doing, and so if I'm to understand this correctly, so the goal is not the goal, but a little notion of trading leagues is to, in a way, make it playful, make the whole concept of trading a bit playful, so that, as you mentioned with your example of the fantasy basketball, you can learn as much as you can about the trading market, and about the financial market in a playful manner. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think maybe playful is maybe too.
Or gamified
Yeah,
manner,
I was gonna
perhaps.
say maybe playful is too playful of a term, so because it
Yeah.
makes it sound like, but yeah, I think thinking of it as a game, as a micro event, right? As a micro event where, so the typical game on trading leagues lasts minutes, right? We have games that also last, an hour, and others which last a day. And we're thinking of launching weekly games as well. But when I'm engaged in something for just a few minutes, my brain is 100% focused on whatever I'm doing
Yeah,
because it's
yeah, yeah, yeah.
time based and I'm not getting distracted by other things. And so, and even drawing this back to chess, I think that's one of the beautiful things about chess is that you're playing a game. You have blitz chess, you have bullet chess, and you have all these game formats. And when you're playing that chess game, man, like it's very hard to get distracted, because you're
Yeah.
you're just thinking about that activity, and so your focus is through the roof. And that oftentimes doesn't happen with day trading. I mean, it does happen with day trading, but then unfortunately, what also happens over there is you're also stressed, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah,
a
for sure.
different beast altogether, right? Because if I'm
Yeah.
operating under a condition of I don't want to lose versus I'm trying to win, that changes my perspective on the whole situation, right? So, like, with day trading, I remember my days as an active trader. It's a very anxiety inducing activity, especially when you have a lot of
Yeah.
money on the line. And so, yeah, I think the term playful is definitely not associated with
It's a
trading and
bit too,
investing,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
maybe trading leagues is like slightly playful. Maybe we can use that term.
Slightly. All right, cool. Slightly
Yeah,
playful, but more gamified.
right.
Um, speaking to gamification yet again, you talk about a vast disparity in growth rates between upstocks and trading leagues, and you say that it took you 7 years to get 100,000 users on upstocks and 5 months to get 700,000 users on trading leagues. How much of this success can you attribute to gamification versus more experience or lessons learned when you're starting a new venture?
So this has nothing to do with me. It's just the nature of the industry. So
Okay,
in a stock brokerage, the user has to come in and fund their account with adequate capital, right? You have to have at the minimum hundreds of dollars, probably thousands of dollars, which automatically restricts a lot of people from even seriously considering
I
the
see.
activity,
I see what
right?
you're
So when we
saying. Yeah,
talk about gamification, we're talking about bite-sized, um, bite-sized transactions, and I can deposit money into trading these with just $10. Most of our first-time users come in with just $10, and they essentially get $10 of credits, and then they can go ahead and play usually at least 50 games because the average game is $1 entry fees, and you're going to end up winning games and losing games. So you're experiencing hours of activity for just $10 of entry fees, right?
I see.
And
I
so
see.
because of that proposition, we're getting a lot of first time participants with the financial markets. I think we ran a poll a few months ago. And again, I think it was like around 70% of our users had never engaged actively with the financial markets before trading leagues.
Wow. Okay.
What that's what that's telling us is that we are actually accomplishing our mission, right? Obviously, it's very early, but we are seeing a lot of our users basically experience the financial markets for the first time with trading leagues. And so naturally, the extension of that is the numbers you cited, right? We basically onboarded 100,000 registrations, I think within a year of trading leagues or whatever I
Wow.
had written, maybe 8 months.
Wow.
And then on Upstocks, it took us 7 years. But Upstocks is one of the fastest growing stock brokerages in the world, right? So in the stockbroking space, that is very, very successful. And I would say Trading Leagues is probably following a similar trajectory, but relative to our industry, if that makes sense.
I see. Yeah, no, definitely makes sense. in a way, it's two different, two completely different, companies with different goals and different target audiences. Regarding the marketing, could you just quickly talk about some of the strategies you use to onboard so many users in such a short amount of time?
Yeah. So, Trading Leagues essentially has gone through two different phases. The first phase was when we were an India only business. At that time, we experimented a lot. We worked with influencers. We did performance marketing. That's basically, running AdWords and different types of ads on social media platforms. We experiment with a referral plan. We were giving credits away. So, for
Okay.
those of your listeners who are glued into the entrepreneurship world, right?
Yeah.
PayPal, when it was launched, they basically had this amazing campaign where they were paying users money to
Oh
use
yeah.
PayPal. They
Yeah.
were giving them $10
Right.
just to use PayPal, right? We tried something similar for Trading Leagues. Long story short, it failed disastrously. So
Really
it did not work
interesting.
because the unit economics did not work out at all. For in our case, the transaction volumes are
I
very
see.
small, and but we experimented a lot. And then when we launched the global version of the app, 5 months ago, one good thing that happened was that we basically knew what was going to work and not work. And what works for us is a very strong referral program. Plus, we have community managers who essentially are tasked with onboarding users to their community. So we have like more than 100 community managers in different countries, different regions. And these community managers basically get paid whenever they onboard users to their communities. And those users end up depositing and playing. So all the KPIs are aligned, all the interests are aligned. But it took us a while to kind of figure this out, in the current avatar of Trading Leagues. Yeah.
What's interesting is what you mentioned when you mentioned experimenting while it was an India only application, and I think that's a great strategy. And perhaps someone could learn something from that to kind of test everything out in one location and then um, you know expand from there. You, if I'm correct, you have gotten external capital, right? Investments for Trading Leagues.
That's right.
So how did that go the second time around?
It's a very different situation for me personally because with Upstocks we were in a different place. We had a very strong user base and we had been in operations for many many years. Um, Trading Leagues was relatively a young company when we raised our first round of funding. And so it was a different experience altogether. But ultimately, you have to go through the whole process of fundraising. Everything you read about,
Again.
everything I think Shark Tank, unfortunately, gives the wrong idea of what fundraising is actually all about. It's not
Yeah.
so sexy. It's actually just a very boring
Yeah.
process. You have to go through the entire process. But I think if you do it diligently and going back to that earlier question, really asking yourself, do you need the capital? Is this something that is going to benefit the company? In our case, we felt like it was going to benefit Trading Leagues. And so we spent some time. And then, yeah, I think within a few months, we were able to, I think luckily for us, work with investors who understood what we're doing. And now we're looking to raise our next round of funding right now.
Understood. Understood. Well, definitely good luck with that. Hopefully, it's going to go smoothly for you. What question I have? I hear this notion that for startups or businesses that are starting out and they're looking for funding, let's say around 10 years ago, it was not obligatory for the team or for the entrepreneur, if he's doing it by himself, to already have paid customers. The idea already by itself could be sold to an investor. Whereas today, investors are more keen on investing into businesses or startups that have some sort of not a following, but some sort of a clientele,
Yeah.
be it five people or thousands of people, without any external investment. Is that notion true today? Would you happen to know? And if so, what are some ways for entrepreneurs to manage to sustain certain startups without a lot of funding?
Yeah, there's a term called PMF, right? Product market fit.
Hmm.
In my opinion, it's the most important thing to have and to discover. PMF basically means you have a product over here, you have a market over here, and then making sure that you have discovered a fit, right? Which essentially means what you're saying. You have clientele, but it's not just about having clients. It's also about, is it sustainable? Is it scalable? Because one thing to keep in mind all the time is that the investors also have KPIs, right?
Right.
They have to generate a return on their investments, and they don't have a long amount of time to do that. So they're
Yeah.
also in a certain amount of
Unfortunately.
time also running a startup in some sense, right?
Yeah.
And there is a long-tailed effect there as well, right? If an investor has a portfolio of, let's say, 50 companies, maybe a handful of them are going to do well. This is well-known public information, right? So keeping all that in mind, the inverse of that fact is that, as an investor, you're only going to invest in companies which have the potential to scale like 100x or
I
whatever that
see.
is, right? Otherwise
Yeah.
it's not going to
Yeah.
work out, right? So I think a lot of entrepreneurs forget that inverse. And in fact, Peter Thiel, right, he wrote a book called
Right.
0 to 1, and there's an entire chapter
I read that book. It's
on,
a wonderful
it's a
book.
great book, and I keep going back to it all the
Yeah. Yeah.
time. And in it, he talked about this, this fat tail distribution, right? And essentially, entrepreneurs need to keep that in mind all the time, right? You have to establish PMF. You have to. I think he also talks about monopolizing a small market, right? You should have the ability to really clearly differentiate yourself in the short run, in the long run. I think just reading that book actually, and he's got an entire checklist of things to kind of
Right.
check off. If you check off all those things, you're probably in a
Definitely.
very good place. But yeah, establishing PMF, and I think I think it also depends on the funding environment, right? I mean, going back to your question, and the industry, right? If you're building something in AI right now, right? Then maybe you can
Yeah,
get
that's hot.
away. Maybe you can get away with not having clients, right? If you have a great technology,
Right.
um, but
I see. I see.
right.
Yeah.
So it really depends on what you're doing, your competition, but it always helps to have established PMF. And forgetting about the investors, you should do it for yourself, right? Because if you have PMF, then you know that you've got a business model that has legs, and you're probably going to get a better valuation anyways by having established PMF. So right, so it's probably in your best interest to establish a product market fit and then raise capital.
That's great advice. That's really great advice. Something that you can't really search for that on Google and find certain answers. So thank you for sharing that with us today. And just to continue speaking about gamification, you mentioned that you were playing games when you were younger, and I there's definitely a connection between games and gamification, and perhaps it's a relative question and sorry, a relevant question. And if it's not relevant, you let me know. What in your mind is the difference between gamification design and normal game design? Because from what I understand, there are certain differences, and I just want anybody who's a gamer listening to this to understand difference between game design and gamification, in your opinion.
Yeah, that's actually interesting question. So I'm not sure if I have the
Thank you.
exact answer to that,
Okay.
but because I'm actually not like a hardcore gamer, and in fact, only
Yeah.
after I launched Trading Leagues have I started to learn a little bit more about the gaming space. But maybe one way of looking at it is game design is when you're designing a game. So when your application itself is a game, then a lot of things are going to come into play. And then gamification could potentially mean different functions of your application are gamified, right? So, for example, and again, I'm not sure if that's exactly what it is, but one application comes to my mind. Um, I use a task manager called Todoist, and it's a very simple application, super simple, but I've been using it for years, so I'm assuming it's a great app. And it's just like one of those apps where you assign yourself tasks, right, for different projects. like a Trello or whatever, but it's even simpler than Trello.
Yeah.
It's super, super easy to use. And you have priority one, priority two, priority three. But what always gets me going is whenever you knock off 10 tasks, it says good job. You did 10 tasks today,
Okay.
or 5 tasks today, 10 tasks today, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that's an element of gamification. I'm assuming at the brain
I
level,
see.
something is
Okay.
probably happening, right? Maybe I'm registering some dopamine. I don't know if I'm using the right term there, but something is happening. Wait, I'm feeling happy because I'm accomplishing some goal, or yeah, I mean some goal. Whether I set that goal or not, I feel like I accomplished something. But it's not like Todoist is a gaming application, right? Um,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
maybe a different way of thinking about that. Again, I'm not sure if this is correct, but when we wake up in the morning and oftentimes want to check social media, we want to check the number of notifications, right? Maybe there's some sort of a
Yeah.
gamification happening over there potentially. I don't know.
Yeah. To
Right?
see those pop-ups,
Yeah,
right?
like maybe I'm thinking of it as like something that makes me happy, and there's like I'm thinking of it as like something I need to do. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, but I think that's probably what comes to mind: game design versus
Understood.
gamification.
So essentially, so game design is building a game to be played as a
Yeah,
game, and gamification is adding game-like elements to rather mundane applications or whatnot, like whatever, just to make that process of using it a bit more interesting or
yeah,
something like that.
I would assume
That's
so. I
okay.
would assume so. That's what comes to mind. Yeah.
And since we're speaking about gaming, and this is a gaming related channel, and you mentioned that you're played when you were younger, although you're not a hardcore gamer, and you are slowly kind of getting into the whole world of video games in the market, which is one of the not one of but the biggest entertainment market currently. What in your mind is the future of gaming, video games, and the gamification of things? Say in the next 20 to 50 years.
So that's a really interesting question as well. So I think a lot of spaces are going to find industries are going to find ways to reinvent themselves with gamification, right? There's multiple reasons for that. Number one, um, as you mentioned, gaming is a growing industry, right? So we're playing more and more games, right? Going back to chess, it's not a coincidence that chess has taken off now because we all have access to phones, and it's also the network effects, right? When many of us are doing something and playing games against each other in one platform, it actually becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of a situation. So you
Right.
take like a
Right.
situation like the financial markets, which has historically been associated with, a very kind of serious formal activity. And now we are coming along trying to gamify. There's other applications as well, which are trying to do something, at least introducing gamified elements to their applications to an otherwise very serious formal industry. And so what I would predict is, similar things can happen in other industries as well. I don't know what industries that would be, right? I can't think of any off the top of my off the top of my mind. But one thing to also keep in mind is that time is a resource, and we have 24 hours in a day. And if more and more things are getting automated, then something has to keep us busy, right? Otherwise, we're going to get bored.
Right.
And
Yeah.
right, and so when I have games to play, right, it keeps my mind engaged. I'm having fun, and so maybe that gets translated into taking an otherwise non-gamified space and finding ways to introduce elements of gamification just to keep the customer engaged, right? One idea that comes to my mind, again, I'm not even sure if I'm thinking about this correctly, but self-driving cars is already here. That concept is already here, right? I would say in the next maybe 5-10 years, at least the next 10 years, I think most of us will be probably driving self-driving cars, right? Potentially, right? Especially in certain countries.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what is a user going to do while they're sitting in the car, right? Maybe in the
A
car,
good
right?
question.
Maybe they're going to be playing games, right? Maybe the car comes
Yeah, yeah,
prepackaged
definitely.
with certain things you can do to keep your mind engaged, right? So I think one really cool thing that's happening though is as a society, we're not looking at games as like a negative thing anymore, right? I think there's a
Right.
stigma,
Yes.
especially as being an Indian, not that I'm blaming my parents, but they always looked at games as like this like thing that kids did, and it just like
Yeah.
it's almost like a negative activity in some way, right?
Right.
Um, Not that they ever blatantly told me that, but that was the I always felt like, oh, I'm just wasting time playing games, right? And now the research and science has shown that as long as you're not addicted and all that stuff, and you're doing it in a healthy way, that games can actually stimulate your brain, And even with my kids, I encourage them to play games. Right, my older son is
I
8.
was gonna ask you actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he plays Roblox, and I love it. I mean,
Nice.
I have a
Good.
time limit, right? Everything is time constrained. He's got to do his homework first and all that. But he plays some video
Of
games every
course.
day, and it's really interesting. Like when you see these kids play, like they're so fast, and it's just absolutely
Yeah.
amazing how like I'm just wondering like what's going on in their brain, when they're playing these things. Like
Right.
it's probably on fire, right? And so
Yeah.
it's really cool. It's actually really really cool, and I think that's a trend that's like here to stay.
It's really awesome to hear that you actually encourage gaming. I want to do the same thing with my son as well when he gets a little bit older. And, I want to see the day where I can finally sit down with him and, play a game together and kind of
Right.
talk about it and see what goes on in his head. So, I agree actually with everything that you're saying. I fully agree that, gaming is here to stay. And I think markets will, so not all markets but some markets will adapt to games being very very predominant in our everyday life, because also just as a side note, perhaps perhaps maybe my generation or the generation just before mine will be the first generation where practically all the grandparents are going to be gamers. So like that's the craziest part. And the more we go, or the farther we go into the future, the more and more gamers they're going to be, from ages of whatever 5 till 80, 85, whatever. So I don't see myself stopping playing games, hopefully, if I live to 80, 85 years old. And that opens up more markets, more types of games for different age groups that don't exist today. you know Gamers, or not gamers, sorry, people at 85 years old today don't necessarily play games, but I hope that I will, and I hope that by the time that I will, somebody's going to make a game to satisfy my 85-year-old self in the future.
I'm
So
sure they will.
it's yeah,
I'm sure there's going to be a
definitely,
market for that. And
definitely, definitely.
yeah, I think whenever there's a market, the product kind of just emerges, right? So
Yeah,
and going
yeah,
back to
yeah.
what you're saying earlier, with playing games with your son, chess is actually one of those games. Like you play chess, and when you play against a kid, the way they approach something like chess is so different versus like adults, because as adults we've learned all the openings and we play all the boring openings. And my younger son will just like bust out like his queen like early on and just like
Straight away.
like wreck havoc. And I'm like, dude, like what are you doing, so yeah, I mean, and
Yeah.
games have that unifying factor as well, right? They can bring generations. Like if whether you can have an 80-year-old playing a 5-year-old, and things just happen, right? I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
well, that's how I was taught chess. Actually, my grandfather, he was a bit younger than that, but you're absolutely right, and it's such a unique thought actually that you put in my head, to see that an 8-year-old can play chess with a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old, and it's an awesome awesome little moment that you share in a format of playing a game. And yeah, that's very very unique to, not gaming as in digital game, but gaming in general, right? Be it tabletop games or digital games. So yeah, games are here to stay.
hundred
That's for
percent,
sure.
100%. They're not going anywhere, man.
And I'm running a ongoing section on the podcast where my previous guest asks a question to my current guest, and my previous guest asks,
I'll ask what your favorite retro video game was.
So I would have to go to Super Mario 64.
right,
Right, the
nice, it's a good
the
choice.
one that came with the console, with the
Right.
N64. I'm not sure if this is
Yeah,
before your
yeah, yeah. Oh,
time,
that's an awesome one.
but the one that came
No,
with,
I actually
yeah.
played the
Okay,
N64.
there we go. Okay,
I
okay.
did.
And that was just like a magical game, because I remember when the N64 came out, and I was just like, dude, what is this thing? Right? It's just like so crazy.
Yeah.
I remember there was a Sega console as well, but Nintendo just like destroyed everything when it came out with N64. And so that comes to mind. If you go even before that, I remember the original Nintendo, the Super Mario Bros. One, two, not Super, sorry, the Mario One, Mario Two, Mario Three, right? The original Mario's, and then there was the Duck Hunt, the Duck Hunt game.
Oh yeah, of course.
So
Right, with
like
the gun.
that was really interesting because
Cool.
it was engaging, right? There's an actual console associated with it, and then I mean I'm keeping it retro. Like I'm not talking about like down the road,
Yeah, yeah, retro for
because
sure. Yeah, yeah, definitely.
I went through a phase after like my teens where I wasn't really playing like video games, like in college and stuff. I think a lot of my friends would play Call of Duty and stuff like that. I never played video games after that. And then I got more into like FIFA and NBA and all that. But then one game comes to mind. I don't remember the name of the game, but I would go to the arcade just to play this like wrestling game. Right, I was obsessed with like WWF, and it's like I remember like I would always like go there with quarters and like just like spend like hours with my friends, and it was so much
Okay.
fun.
I wish I could know the names. Interesting. So it's a wrestling as in like WWE style,
Yeah,
right?
WWF. Yeah, like this is like probably
Okay,
the
cool.
mid
F.
'90s, right? Early mid
Okay,
'90s,
cool.
and
Awesome.
super fun. Like they had like all the classic wrestlers like Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior, and all that.
Yeah.
And the cool thing was like they had the finishing moves, of like each of the wrestlers, and like you're always trying to figure out what move to like how to actually execute the finishing move. Um, and
Right, to do the
then
combo.
right through the combo, and then obviously Street Fighter, right, was a classic.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The original Street Fighter
Oh, so
games. Yeah.
you were a gamer back in the day. Like you played so many games.
So I
Wow.
mean, whenever I would go to the arcade, I would play a lot.
Yeah, I would imagine the arcade was, the real deal back in the day.
Right.
People were like, when I was speaking to my previous guest, he was saying that the arcade was, the place to be to play and just to hang out with friends and whatnot. So yeah, I wish I could have been in one of those just to experience all that.
Super good times, man. Good times. Yeah.
If I may ask you to leave a question for my future guest.
Yeah, I would flip that question and I would say,
Oh wow, my goodness, that's such an awesome question. It's a really, really good question. Makes me think of what would it be, but I can't give an answer right now because I need to analyze it. I need to take some time to analyze everything. And a question that I ask to all my guests as well, seeing as this is a podcast related to the video game industry, I want to know, what is a video game for you? What defines a video game for you?
so to me, a video game is obviously something I'm seeing in a screen format, the term video. So I'm playing a game on a screen. It is an interactive game where, based on my inputs, something is being displayed in front of me. There is an objective to my activity. I'm trying to win something, and I'm having fun. And ideally, it involves other characters or other people, but doesn't have to.
That's really cool. You know what? I say this also to all my guests, that there's no wrong answer. And the reason I ask this question is just to kind of get a collection of thoughts about, what a video game means to each and every one of my guests. And, everyone has their own little answer that kind of relates to one another, but is different from one another. And it's really unique and an interesting experiment that I believe is going on to kind of see, uh, that kind of exposes to me that video games mean so many different things to so many different people, and it's just, to me, it's very wonderful to know. So thank
And
you,
I'm sure you're going to get a
thank you for
different
that.
answer if you open up Webster's dictionary.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's going to be more down to earth, more
Right.
legit.
Right.
And just, before we close out our conversation here today, to anyone thinking about pursuing an entrepreneurial route, sorry, in life, what would be some, of your words of advice to them?
So I'll try to keep it to like maybe two or three. Number one,
Yeah, yeah, sure.
make sure you do something that you're good at, or try to do something that you're good at and you have a natural affinity for. Number two, make sure you enjoy what you're doing. So those two things can be separate, right? I could do something that I'm good at, which I may not enjoy. So make sure you do something that you're good at, which you also enjoy. And then just going back to what we discussed earlier, have a long-term vision in mind. If you need to print that out or whatever it is, make sure you know exactly what is it that you're trying to do, with a long-term vision, a very clear long-term vision. And then the last thing I would say is just don't give up, keep going. Um,
Right.
Unless you can objectively tell yourself that it's the right decision to stop pursuing that activity.
Right, right. Great words. Well, there you have it, everybody. So if any of you are pursuing, go get it. Go get it. Go achieve all your goals. Raghu, thank you so very much for the conversation today. I definitely learned a lot. There's so many more questions that I have for you, and perhaps we could, have another conversation one day to
Sure.
see, how that's going to go. But thank you so much for the conversation. It was very insightful. Personally, from my side, I'm wishing you nothing but the best in all your endeavors, especially now with trading leagues. I hope to see it grow. And I was very interested to find out the information about it and how it got started. And thank you for sharing your knowledge with the viewers as well and motivating them and myself as well included with your journey. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for the opportunity and for the podcast interview, and wishing you all the best.